Imagine you have to operate on the most powerful man in the world, in the most delicate part of his body, and you have no tools, no textbooks, not the slightest idea how to do it. The price of failure is your own head. This was precisely the situation Charles-François Félix found himself in during 1686. His patient was the Sun King, Louis XIV, and the diagnosis was a monarch's worst nightmare, especially for a king whose life was a constant public spectacle, an anal fistula. Simply put, a festering channel that caused the king excruciating pain. He could no longer sit on his throne. He couldn't ride a horse. Every step was torture. All of France's medicine proved helpless. For months, the king was tormented with poultices, washes, and prayers. Nothing worked. The fistula only grew, undermining the monarch's grandeur. And then, desperate courtiers turned their gaze to a surgeon, to Félix. He was, in essence, commanded. Do something, or we'll find someone who will. This was more than just an order. It was a death sentence with a stay of execution. No one in the world had ever successfully performed such an operation. One wrong move of the knife, and France would have a new king, and Félix, the executioner's block. To grasp the full horror of the situation, we must forget everything we know about modern medicine. In the 17th century, a surgeon was not a doctor. A doctor was a scholarly gentleman in a wig who read Latin, quoted Galen, and prescribed enemas and powders. A surgeon was a craftsman, almost a butcher. His place was not in a university, but in a barber shop, next to a shaving basin and tooth extraction forceps. He was a bone setter, a bloodletter, one who lanced boils and amputated limbs on the battlefield. His instruments were not delicate scalpels. They were crude saws, hooks, knives, and pincers, simply wiped clean with a rag after use. Sterilization was unheard of. Anesthesia didn't exist. Patients were either plied with alcohol until unconscious, or held down by several burly assistants while they thrashed in agony. Screaming was part of the procedure. A surgeon's main talent wasn't precision, but speed. To amputate a shattered leg in a minute before the patient died of shock, that was considered the height of skill. But even if a person survived the table, a far more terrifying enemy awaited them. An invisible killer no one suspected. Infection. Any open wound became a gateway to death. A day or two later, it would begin to fester. Fever would rise, and the body would be racked with chills. Doctors merely threw up their hands and spoke of bad humors. The smell of rotting flesh in hospitals was as common as the ringing of church bells. Surviving an operation was a miracle. Most patients died not from the surgeon's knife, but from what followed it. It was into this world, where surgery was synonymous with torture and almost guaranteed death, that the King of France was to be thrown. A man whose body was considered sacred. To entrust his life to a craftsman with a knife, whose colleagues more often sent people to the next world than brought them back to life. Surgery was not salvation. It was a final, one-way ticket, purchased when death was already breathing down one's neck. It was not an act of healing, but an act of desperation. And so, into this desperation, one man was summoned. Charles-François Félix was neither a genius nor a visionary. He was a hereditary barber surgeon, a first-rate craftsman. His father had treated the king. His grandfather had treated the king. Generations spoke through his hands, knowing how to set a bone, cauterize a wound, extract a tooth. He was the best in his field. But his field was lancing boils for court ladies and amputating limbs for guardsmen, not digging a knife into the body of God's anointed. Then, one autumn day in 1686, he was summoned to Versailles, not to the servants' quarters, but to the king's private chambers. The air there was heavy, smelling not of perfume and wax, but of illness and fear. All-powerful ministers, brilliant marquises, they all looked at him with the same desperate hope, as if he were not a barber but a messiah. And the king's chief physician, Daquin, uttered words that made Félix's blood run cold. The king is suffering. We have done all we could. Now it is your turn. It wasn't a request. The glances of the courtiers, the gnashing of the monarch's own teeth audible from behind the screen, all conveyed one message: heal him, or die. Cold sweat broke out beneath his powdered wig. He, Charles-François Félix, had to take a knife and cut where one wrong move could cause unstoppable bleeding, or introduce an infection that would kill the king in 3 days, or leave him crippled for life. Any of these outcomes meant only one thing for him: the scaffold in Place de Grève. He could not refuse. Refusal was an admission of powerlessness, and therefore an insult to His Majesty. It was the same scaffold, only without the attempt to save himself. He was trapped, locked in the golden cage of Versailles, alone with the royal fistula and his own terror. And the moment he bowed his head and mumbled, "I will do my best, sire," his old life ended. He ceased to be merely a surgeon. He became a man who, in a matter of months, had to invent a miracle. Felix returned home, utterly devastated. He scoured every book he could find. Nothing. He questioned every colleague he knew. They merely shook their heads sympathetically. No one had ever done this before. There were no tools for such delicate work, no methodology, not even an understanding of exactly what needed to be cut. And Felix realized he wasn't just going to perform an operation, he was going to invent it, from scratch, on a living king, and his only textbook would be his own fear, and fear drove him into the streets, to the darkest, dirtiest corners of Paris, to hospitals for the poor, to foul prisons. He needed test subjects, people with the same affliction as the king, people whose lives were worth nothing, but whose suffering could buy him his own. With royal gold in his pocket and a royal decree in hand, he began his grim harvest. He found them by the dozens, beggars, vagrants, crippled soldiers, prisoners condemned to death. To all of them, he promised the same thing, a royal pension and freedom if they survived, and a swift death on his table if they didn't. For many, it was the best choice they had ever been offered. He converted an outbuilding at his home into an operating room and a morgue simultaneously. And the nightmare began. The first operations were catastrophic. He tried cutting this way, then that, deeper, shallower. He tried cauterizing wounds, irrigating them with wine, dusting them with powders. Nothing worked. People died. They died from bleeding right on the table. They died from fever 3 days later. They died in agony from infection a week later. After each death, Felix stayed awake. He sat over the cooling body, staring at his handiwork, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. Each corpse was a silent reproach. Every dead face whispered to him, "This awaits your king. This awaits you." He realized his instruments were useless. The barber's knives were too crude, the forceps too cumbersome. They tore flesh rather than cut it. And then he did something no surgeon had done before him. He went to a swordsmith, to the best craftsman in Paris, who made rapiers for musketeers and hunting knives for the nobility. At night, by the light of tallow candles, they sat together. Felix drew strange, curved shapes on parchment. He explained with his fingers how a blade should enter the body, how it should navigate around bone, how it should incise the diseased channel without touching healthy tissue. And the swordsmith forged. He forged the thinnest curved scalpel, which would later be called the royal scalpel. He made special scissors with bent tips to work blindly. He created a thin silver probe to feel for the exact path of the fistula. These were not a butcher's tools, they were a jeweler's. Felix held them in his hands, and for the first time in months, something akin to hope stirred within him. He had a weapon. And then one day, he brought in another unfortunate. This was a sturdy peasant, condemned for poaching. Felix acted in a new way, slowly, carefully. He inserted the silver probe, feeling for the path. Then, guiding the blade of the new scalpel precisely along the probe, he made a single, precise incision. He cut open the entire purulent tract from beginning to end. There was little blood. He rinsed the wound and applied a simple dressing soaked in wine. He didn't expect a miracle. He had seen too many deaths. But the next day, the peasant had no fever. 2 days later, the wound hadn't festered. A week later, it began to close with clean, pink flesh. Felix visited him 3 times a day. He looked at this healing wound as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. He couldn't believe his eyes. This man was not dying. He was recovering. A month later, the peasant was walking. 2 months later, he was almost well. Felix had found it. He had found a way. He had invented his miracle, paying for it with dozens of other lives. Now came the most terrifying part, entering the king's chambers and repeating it all on the sacred body of France. And so, that day arrived. November 18th, 1686. The king's bedroom in Versailles was transformed into a sanctuary of fear. Outside, a cold rain fell, while inside, dozens of candles burned, illuminating the pale faces of France's most powerful men from the gloom. Here were ministers, marshals, chief physician Daquin, and even the heir to the throne, the Grand Dauphin. They did not pray. They waited. They waited either for a miracle or for the announcement of the monarchy's demise. Louis lay on his stomach on a specially constructed table. He refused wine and opium. He wanted to face the pain with a clear mind as he faced enemy armies. He was ready. 2 burly guardsmen stood nearby, not to hold him down, but so he could clench their hands when the knife entered his body. This was the only sign of weakness he allowed himself. The room was so silent that the crackling of candle wicks in the candelabras could be heard, and into this silence walked Félix. He was no longer the terrified barber summoned to the king months ago. Before them stood a different man, calm, focused. There was no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was an icy confidence, forged in his makeshift morgue. He nodded silently and laid out his instruments on velvet cloth. They gleamed in the candlelight. The courtiers watched them with a mix of horror and hope. These strange curved pieces of steel looked like instruments of torture, yet in them lay France's last hope. Félix took the silver probe. His fingers did not tremble. He saw before him not a king, but the same wound he had opened 75 times before. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, he inserted the probe, feeling for the blind channel, the cause of all suffering. The king hissed in pain, his fingers whitening as he gripped the guardsman's hands. Then Félix took the scalpel, the royal scalpel. He took a deep breath, held it, and guided the blade precisely along the probe. One incision, deep, clean, confident. There was no fuss, no rush. He worked as if embroidering a delicate pattern. The operation lasted almost 3 hours. 3 hours of deathly silence, broken only by the king's muffled groans and Félix's quiet commands to his assistants. He cleaned everything, incised all the pockets of pus. When he finished, he didn't use any magical powders or healing ointments. He took a simple linen cloth, soaked it in ordinary Burgundy wine, and applied the dressing, exactly as he had done with that nameless poacher. Then he straightened up, bowed, and quietly said, "It is over, sire." But he knew it was a lie. The worst was yet to come. Now, all that remained was to wait. To wait for the fever, chills, and putrefaction that almost always arrived on the 3rd day. The 1st day passed. Félix did not leave the king's bedside, changing dressings and scrutinizing the monarch's face, catching every breath. There was no fever. The 2nd day passed. The king was able to drink a little broth. The wound was clean. The courtiers began to breathe easier. The 3rd day arrived. Critical. The day when the killer, infection, usually came. Morning turned to afternoon, afternoon to evening. Nothing. The fever did not come. The king was weak. He suffered from pain, but he was alive, and his body was fighting. It was healing. When a week passed, Versailles erupted in jubilation. A miracle had occurred. The barber had saved the king. Charles-François Félix's name was on everyone's lips. He was showered with gold. The king bestowed upon him a noble title, an estate, and a sum that made him one of the wealthiest men in France. A simple craftsman became an aristocrat overnight. He stood near the throne, and yesterday's dukes and marquises now sought his gaze, bowed to him, fawned over him. He had won. He had looked death in the eye and forced it to retreat. It seemed like the end of the story, a happy ending. But in reality, it was just the beginning of a new war. While Versailles celebrated, black envy simmered in Paris. The first to taste the poison on their lips were the doctors, those scholarly gentlemen from the Paris Faculty of Medicine who had spent months shrugging their shoulders at the king's bedside. They, who read Latin and quoted ancient Greeks, were humiliated. Their diplomas, their dissertations, their powdered wigs, all proved to be useless junk compared to the knife of a simple bone setter. This upstart didn't just cure the king. He passed judgment on their entire science. He showed the world that their knowledge was hollow, and they would not forgive him. Behind them, Félix's colleagues from the College of Surgeons also raised their heads. They should have been proud. One of their own had elevated their craft to unprecedented heights. But instead of pride, their souls burned with jealousy. Just yesterday, Felix had been one of them. They had drunk wine together, discussed difficult cases, complained about the arrogance of doctors. And today, he was a radiant nobleman, a friend of the king. He was no longer their equal. He had soared so high that they couldn't reach him, and the only way to bring him back to earth was to drag his name through the mud. And rumors began to spread. First, in quiet whispers in reception rooms and barber shops, then louder and louder. They said Felix was a butcher, that he had killed 75 people in his gruesome experiments, that he had bought his success with the blood of the poor. This was true, but in the mouths of his enemies, it became an accusation of a monstrous crime. They said the king had simply been lucky, that Felix's methods were barbaric, and anyone else in his place would have simply butchered the monarch. They said the wound was about to reopen, that putrefaction had already begun inside, and the king was doomed. Doctors wrote anonymous pamphlets, ridiculing the barber aristocrat and his instruments of torture. Surgeons filed official complaints demanding an investigation into his inhumane experiments. They tried to strip him of his glory, diminish his achievement, prove to everyone that he was not a genius, but a lucky charlatan. Felix had saved the life of one man, the most important in the kingdom, but in doing so, he signed his own death warrant in the eyes of the entire medical world. He thought his main enemy was the king's fistula. He was wrong. His true enemies were only now unsheathing their knives. But the poison they sprayed failed to hit its mark. While envious whispers filled the dark alleys of Paris, something else was happening in the shining halls of Versailles. The king didn't just survive, he flourished. By January 1687, just 2 months after the operation, Louis was back in the saddle. He hunted. He danced at balls. He presided over the Council of State for hours, and there was no trace of his former pain on his face. Every step he took, every laugh, every confident gesture was a living refutation of all the slander. He was walking, breathing, ruling proof of Felix's genius. And the courtiers, those living barometers of royal will, instantly caught the wind of change. They saw how the king regarded his savior. He didn't just thank him. He listened to him. He consulted with him. He made the barber his confidant. And then something utterly unimaginable happened, something that could only occur in the mad theater of Versailles. The entire court went mad for the anal fistula. This is not a joke. To have the same ailment as the king, and to be cured by the same miraculous method, became the height of fashion. It was a sign of chosenness, a mark of closeness to the monarch. Dozens of aristocrats, who had nothing more than a slight discomfort, suddenly began complaining of unbearable pain. They simulated symptoms. They begged Felix to operate on them. They wanted a royal wound. The operation on the posterior became the most fashionable accessory of the season. Special cushions even appeared, worn under clothing to imitate the king's bandage. This wave of madness swept across France. A la Felix wigs appeared. Ladies wore ribbons in their hair, tied in a special knot supposedly replicating the shape of surgical instruments. Composers wrote music. A cantata, The Healing of the King, was performed in cathedrals. The poet Charles Perrault, author of Cinderella and Puss in Boots, wrote an ode in honor of the surgeon. Felix became a national hero. His name was a symbol not just of healing, but of a miracle. And Louis XIV delivered the final, crushing blow to Felix's enemies. He understood that it wasn't about one man, it was about the craft itself. He saw the chasm between pompous doctors with their useless Latin and practical surgeons who knew how to work with their hands. And he decided to bridge that gap. By royal decree, he elevated surgery to the status of medicine. He founded the Royal Academy of Surgery, separating it from the barbers and granting it university status. He ordered Felix to write a textbook, detailing his method so that every surgeon in France could learn it. This was the end of the old world. The doctors' pamphlets became waste paper, their complaints, laughable babble. They tried to bury Felix in mud, and he, in turn, built the foundation for a new science from that mud. He didn't just win an argument, he changed the rules of the game. Now, a surgeon was no longer a butcher from a barber shop. He was a scholar. He was a savior. And all of this was done by one man with a knife in his hand, who simply desperately didn't want his head cut off. And he wrote that book. It wasn't a philosophical treatise. It was a dry, clear instruction manual for survival. How to hold the scalpel. At what angle to cut, how deep to insert the probe, how to irrigate the wound, how to apply the dressing. No discussions of miasmas and humors, only what worked. And this book, written in the blood of 75 nameless poor, spread across Europe. It was copied by hand, secretly translated into all languages. Surgeons in London, Madrid, and Vienna read it by candlelight at night, and their breath caught. It was a revelation. Following the book came the instruments. Blacksmiths and armorers across France received orders for the royal scalpel, for curved scissors, for silver probes. What Félix invented for one single operation became the standard. The surgeon's arsenal changed forever. The crude saws and butcher's pincers gave way to precise, almost jeweler's tools. Now, a surgeon could work delicately, avoiding vital vessels, preserving healthy tissues, rather than tearing and hacking. It was like giving sight to the blind. But most importantly, the people themselves changed. The Royal Academy of Surgery opened its doors. And not just barber apprentices went there. Educated young men, sons of bourgeois and even impoverished nobles enrolled. Being a surgeon ceased to be shameful. It became honorable. They were taught not only how to cut. They were forced to study anatomy on cadavers, read books, and pass exams. For the first time in hundreds of years, a surgeon had to think first, then act. A generation of craftsmen was replaced by a generation of scholars with sharp scalpels in their hands. And all of this was reflected in thousands of operating rooms across the country. Of course, anesthesia still didn't exist. Of course, people still died from infections. But the chance of survival increased dramatically. An operation ceased to be an almost guaranteed death sentence. It became a risk, but a justified risk. A patient lying under the knife now knew the person before him wasn't just waving a blade randomly. He was following a method that had saved the Sun King himself. Thus, one operation, performed under the threat of execution, saved not only one monarch. It saved countless lives in the future. It transformed torture into a procedure and a craft into a science. Charles-François Félix lived a long and very wealthy life. He died a very old man, a nobleman, surrounded by honor and students who called him the father of new surgery. His name was engraved in gold on the walls of the academy. His method was studied in universities across the continent. His instruments, born of fear and desperation, saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the centuries that followed. But this grand revolution, this entire new science, all this salvation, did not stem from a stroke of genius, nor from a noble desire to serve humanity. At its core lay the simplest and most powerful engine in the world, the primal animal fear of one man who was once told, "Perform a miracle, or we will cut off your head."